Hey guys, what's going on? Steven back again, and I'm back with another 40K video from Warhammer. So I am doing more Chaos Gods. So the title of this video is Slaanesh is an absolute mess. Not sure what he means by that. Not sure if he means like the lore is an absolute mess, the rules, the models, or like a mess, like a horrific mess lore-ish wise. So I'm not 100% sure what he means by that. But, you know, I do like the Emperor's Children and stuff like that. I think Fulgrim's pretty cool. Although, like, some of their writing and stuff like that is pretty meh, from what I've heard. You know, like, Lucius and stuff like that is, like, pretty terribly written. Even though his model does look actually pretty badass and stuff like that. But, like, I guess he's, like, a shitty duelist and stuff like that. And he, like, always loses, but then he always comes back because they always take pride in killing him. You know, I hear Fulgrim's kind of like an iffy written Primarch and stuff like that. I mean, yes, he does look cool and stuff like that. His model looks badass, not gonna lie. That's kind of why, you know, I like the Emperor's Children, just because that, you know, the Demon Fulgrim looks awesome, along with some of their other models and stuff like that. And of course, their paint schemes, you know, pretty cool as well. You know, gold and purple and stuff like that, and blacks, you know, pretty cool. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what he means by an absolute mess. Who knows? Alright, so before we get into the video, if you had to serve a Chaos God, which Chaos God would you serve and why? Let me know. Alright, so anyways, let's get on to the video. Here we go.
I don't think it's a stretch to say that no deity in 40k has sparked nearly as much debate, discomfort, and straight-up confusion as the Dark Prince of Pleasure, Slaanesh. Depending upon who you ask, Slaanesh is either a fascinating and horrifying exploration of humanity's extremes, or an outdated caricature from Warhammer's early history that Games Workshop can't seem to figure out what to do with. As a character in a faction, Slaanesh and their units have undergone some pretty drastic and not always consistent changes over the years, from their overtly hedonistic and perverted origins to their modern portrayal as a god of excess and
I do like the Keeper of Secrets, those things are pretty
Slaanesh's
cool.
identity has been rewritten, reinterpreted, and re-examined multiple times.
Yeah,
Certain
seeing
elements
Nakari looks
pertaining to
awesome.
them have been dialed up to 11, while others have been sanitized or censored. But has all of this ended up working out in Slaanesh's favor? Has it made them both more compelling from the audience's perspective, and probably more importantly, more marketable from Games Workshop's? Or has all of this left them in a strange, contradictory middle ground?
That's kind of important.
Or their model line accurately reflects what She Who Thirst is supposed to represent. I'm just gonna let you know right now, even though I consider myself a fan of Slaanesh, I've got a lot of problems with that. From Games Workshop's confused and contradictory messaging about what Slaanesh is supposed to be, to a model line that is somehow creatively bankrupt.
Okay, so he basically said
the
main part right there. Marketing.
To the lore itself, where despite having had more than 20 years to figure this out, Slaanesh still feels out of place and underutilized within the Chaos Pantheon. In this video, we're going to explore Slaanesh's early real-world history, how they were first introduced to us in the late 80s, and how they've morphed into their more modern interpretation. We're also going to be examining all of the problems that surround this particular Chaos deity, in order to figure out why Games Workshop seems to be so hesitant to utilize them in any meaningful way. Also, a quick content warning: due to the nature of this particular topic, we're going to be discussing things of a more sexual nature and the role that sex plays in Slaanesh's lore, their model range, and overall brand. There's not going to be any graphic imagery or anything like that, but I just figured I'd give you the heads up in case you're watching this video with kids or family around. Anyways, with all that said, let's dive headfirst into the grimdark. But first, this video is sponsored by Into the AM.
Okay, so there we go, right there. Marketing,
now, if you've been
like I
watching my
said.
content for a long time, then you know that Into the AM's basically
If it's
been
because
with us
they're
since
not
the beginning.
so
They're the longest running sponsor that we've ever had on this
sexualized,
channel.
that's probably
So,
why.
I just wanted
How
to
do you
extend a
market
huge thank
something
you to
with
all of you for making that so successful.
boobs and a
I've been wearing
dick
their products
and,
for
you know,
over 2
all that
years now,
stuff?
and I'm a
You
huge
know,
fan of the brand.
little
Their
difficult.
shirts are easily
Easier to
the
do that
comfiest
with,
that
like,
I own.
corn,
Not
you
only
know,
that, but they
big,
have a
jacked
massive
muscle,
catalog of
you
different
know,
designs.
creatures and
So no
stuff
matter
like
who
that,
you
or
are, they've got a
Nurgle,
that's perfect
plague,
for you.
disease,
And speaking of which, if you didn't know, they just dropped a
you
whole
know?
bunch of new ones. I love what their artists are able to come up with. Their designs are unique, loud, and colorful without ever feeling too
how do you market
top.
something
So going into this new year, you can
sexual?
bet that I'm personally planning on upgrading my wardrobe by picking up
of course
a whole bunch
with
of these new shirts. And if you're like me
Warhammer
and also want to elevate
getting
your style,
more
I've got
and
some good
more
news.
mainstream,
Into the AM gives live
with
viewers
all the
10%
games
off
and
their
stuff
entire
like that,
order when you go to
Space Marine 2, Total
intotheam.com/westhammer,
War and stuff
or
like
use
that. Now
code
you're
Westhammer
attracting a
at
bigger and
checkout.
bigger
Again, that's
audience.
intotheam.com/westhammer,
And now, of course, with the TV shows and stuff like that, whenever those do actually decide to come out,
the links in the description down below.
Not for a while,
Big thanks
it's going to get more eyes on it.
This video.
And now you're going from like a
Before we
niche,
dive into the real meat and
a niche market with like a certain,
Slaanesh, including Games Workshop,
a niche market with a certain demographic and stuff like that. Like, okay, this is our player base, dudes from, I don't know, 17 to 45, I don't know. That's, mainly our demographic. Okay, let's cater to that. And okay, they can handle adult themes, but now that, it's getting a little bit more mainstream, maybe some younger kids are starting to get into it, and it's like, ooh, I don't know, could we do that? Do we want like younger kids to see that type of stuff, even though it's really, not meant for them? But I'm sure there's probably like younger kids playing like Total War and stuff, and that's just kind of my guess.
Indecisiveness about what to do with them. We need to know how they were originally portrayed in Warhammer's early lore. Honestly, it's kind of ironic, because many Warhammer fans, myself included, and even Games Workshop themselves, will tell you that Slaanesh isn't just a sex god. They are the god of excess in all of its forms, and sexuality is only a very tiny, minuscule part of the grand spectrum of excess. Though this is without a doubt true, it didn't always used to be like this. In fact, when Slaanesh made their debut in the second round of Chaos Slaves to Darkness in 1989, the Dark Prince really was only
that is still one of the
with
creepiest pictures I've ever seen.
Specific type of excess. On the very first page in the Slaanesh section, it states that Slaanesh is first and foremost the Lord of Pleasure, the power of chaos dedicated to the pursuit of hedonistic pleasures and the overthrow of all codes of decent behavior. He reigns in a vast and luxuriously appointed palace in the void, where favored followers litter the floors, indulging themselves in all forms of perverse pleasures of the flesh. Worship of Slaanesh takes the form of great orgies involving every vice and perversity. All are welcome within the cults of Slaanesh. The only requirement is an unswerving dedication to the pursuit of pleasure and a willingness to explore every possible vice and perversion. Later on, in the section dedicated to the servants of Slaanesh, namely their demons, it states that when amassed on the field of battle, the electric colors of their contorted forms offend the eye as their diseased lewdness offends the mind. Half-bare torsos of pink and blue boast of unreined
pink
lust.
and blue.
Others
Interesting.
display limbs of glistening greens and yellows, pale shades of corruption which belie the darkness they hide inside. They have abandoned the last vestiges of true decency and sacrificed their humanity to serve the dark power of the master of carnal joys and spread his corruption amongst the innocent. So that's some pretty heavy stuff, but let's compare it to something a bit more modern. Now, I'm personally reading from the 8th edition Demon Codex, as it's the one I currently have available, but you'll find similar depictions in the 9th edition version as well. And make a note of how similar the text is, but the things that do change are pretty important. Here it states that Slaanesh is the Lord of Pleasure, the dark god dedicated to the pursuit of earthly gratification and the overthrow of all decent behavior. He is the god of obsession, the master of excess in all things, from gluttony to lust to megalomania. Wherever mortals are ruled by their own unquenchable desires, the Dark Prince is there in the shadows, whispering, tempting, and feasting on a banquet of souls. Slaanesh's legions of excess strike with sinuous grace, hitting the foe in a whirling blur of lithe and bladed limbs. As they do so, they are at once horrific and alluring, mesmerizing and loathsome. Slaanesh's demon legions vary in composition and purpose, but all desire to spread their lord's corruption. Although neither one of these versions goes into any kind of graphic depictions of not safe for work material,
Right.
when you compare them side by side, it's clear that the original version was much more overtly sexual in nature. It
Right.
had a lot more direct references to the pleasures of the flesh.
Don't forget different writers. You know, when was second edition? How many years ago was that? A long time ago. So I'm sure whoever wrote that is not working there anymore, not writing anything for them in a long time. So different times, different writers, different perspectives. You know, yeah, back then it was more sexual, and now it's, you know, a little bit more of basically everything, even though, like, yeah, it does make sense for their models to be more sexual, even though it is more, well, my obsession with, like, drink and food and stuff like that, it's a little hard to, like, have, like, a giant fat demon and stuff like that who's like, oh, well, you know, my gratification is eating and stuff like that. And then I'd be like, well, now you're kind of crossing into, like, Nurgle territory, because, you know, lots of, like, Nurgle's greater demons are all giant, chunky, fat boys and stuff like that, and I guess I kind of get it. I don't know. We'll see.
Desires, and straight up worship in the form of orgies. Now, years later, those elements have been toned down, and Slaanesh is not just the god of pleasure, but a god of excess. Those direct references to sex have been exchanged for more nebulous concepts, like, quote, earthly gratification or unquenchable desires. As technically speaking, there's no reason that those concepts couldn't come in the form of physical intimacy, but they could also apply to a million different things. There's a feeling of coyness in the modern text, both a wink and a plausible deniability. It's like the author is saying that if you hear those terms and the first thing you think of is sexual activity, then that's on you. We're not implying anything specific. In the same vein, sex-adjacent descriptive language can be found in abundance. Words like hedonistic, desire, seductive, sensual, temptation, and many more are thrown around freely, but never in direct reference to pleasure in the form of sexual gratification. If you still don't believe me that Slaanesh used to be way more sexual, then I'd like to present to you the very first Warhammer 40K novel ever written, Inquisitor by Ian Watson, which was later re-released under the title Draco. This book gave us our very first look at what a city of Slaanesh on a demon world actually looked like. And before I get into this, I'm just going to be honest with you. I kind of thought about cutting this segment as it's almost certain to get me demonetized, but it is a piece of Warhammer's history that most people don't know about, so I think it's important to include it here. If you want to help me make up for that and you haven't subscribed to the channel already, go ahead and do so and we'll call it even.
Okay.
But again, fair warning, it's pretty graphic. Luminous veils drip from the glowing soup of the night sky. The buildings of the city ahead were gross idols to corrupted pleasure. Some of those buildings were modeled to represent lascivious deities, many-breasted, many-organed avatars of twisted lust. In the weird veil light, the hunchback shadows of dark gods seemed to brood everywhere. Spouts of flaming gas leapt up, adding further spasmodic illumination. Other great buildings were giant, mutated solo genitalia. Horned phallic towers arose, wrinkled, ribbed, blistered with window pustules. Cancerous breast domes swelled, fondled by scaly-fingered buttresses. Tongue bridges linked these buildings, sliding back and forth. Scrotum pods swayed. Orifice entries pulsed open and shut, glistening. Some buildings were incongruous with each other. Headless, limbless torsos laying side by side, joined abominably. Through his magnoscope, Jack spied nipples that were heavy-duty laser nacelles and lingam shafts that were projectile tubes. The inhabitants were mere ants by comparison, with this architectonic orgy, eager, scurrying ants. Jack's earbead picked up wailing music, drum beats, screams, chants, and the throb of machinery. The city pulsed and palpitated flexibly. Somehow, plasteel and the immaterium were alloyed together. Thus buildings moved, butted one another, penetrated one another, crawled upon one another. Towers bowed and stiffened, the deity buildings caressed and clawed at one another, and the ant-like inhabitants swarmed within, around, and over, sometimes being crushed, sometimes sucked into vents or spewed out. So this Slaanesh city, which again is representative of the deity's essence as it was written at that point in time, is a literal city made out of titties and dangus. But tell me again that Slaanesh has never been just about sex, Games Workshop. Like, what the I'm not going to read out the rest because it somehow gets even more graphic, and honestly reading it in its entirety would add like another 20 minutes to this video. But in the very next scene, we're introduced to a gigantic rotund woman with a cow face that was said to have, quote, rows of tattooed oily bosoms and a hosepipe-sized birth cord in the shape of a writhing serpent that she is seemingly copulating with at all times. This massive beast is borne on a huge resplendent palanquin and is being escorted by an array of bare-headed trader marines. At one point, she starts calling out in a voice loud enough to crack stone and rupture eardrums for her minotaur lover named Bool. She starts screaming about how she wishes to be hung from the ceiling by 100 rings. The whole thing is graphic and uncomfortable to read, but it gives you a really good idea of what Slaanesh was supposed to be like in their earliest incarnations.
Right.
Absolutely filthy.
Could you give us some of your political beliefs?
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism.
Now, obviously, this is not the way Slaanesh is depicted in modern 40K, and I think we can all agree that that's probably for the best. In addition to them becoming the god of excess instead of just the god of pleasure, there was also an increased emphasis put on pain and violence. In their lore, torture would end up becoming a common insert for hedonistic and depraved tendencies over overtly carnal desire. With pleasure now being a small facet of excess, Slaanesh would end up having a lot of nuance added to their lore. In addition to the increased levels of violence and more emphasis being put on Slaanesh's darker themes, they and their associated faction became a much better fit in the grimdark future of Warhammer 40K, a franchise famously characterized by endless war. Although some people, for some reason, might prefer the original version, in my opinion, Slaanesh nowadays is a much more interesting entity. But perhaps more importantly, from Games Workshop's perspective, they're also now a lot more marketable. Although still certainly lacking the broad appeal of something like Loyalist Space Marines, their previous incarnation as an army of sex pests was only ever going to appeal to a pretty small niche group of players. In addition, as Games Workshop is a global corporation that sells models in a lot of different countries, many of whom have laws that restrict what can and cannot be depicted, this change allowed them to avoid a lot of legal issues as they began to expand. However, I do have a lot of issues with Slaanesh's redesign. And that's
in books you can write whatever you want. You don't have to worry about that. But yeah, models and stuff.
Not, namely the art and model line. By the time they got around to making these changes, Slaanesh's brand identity had already been firmly established. For a corporation trying to sell a product, deviating from an established brand is always a risky proposition. If you make too many big changes too quickly, you risk alienating your established customer base that already enjoyed the product as it was before. Even the most subtle of alterations could have enormous consequences in the market. For Games Workshop, this change has resulted in a disconnect between Slaanesh's lore and their model range. They seemingly want to go in one direction with them, but they're still shackled to an outdated brand that they're hesitant to move away from. To me, the Slaanesh models that are available in the 40K tabletop game right now are a direct visual representation of Games Workshop's internal confusion on what to do with Slaanesh and their indecisiveness when it comes to exploring other aspects of this particular deity. But let's explore this a bit deeper by looking at some of these models and their associated artwork, and thus how they're represented in the 40K universe. As from my perspective, even though I like Slaanesh as a deity and as a faction, it's kind of a confused mess. To get the pros out of the way first, on the surface level, the overall design philosophy that governs how a Slaaneshi unit should look succeeds in being unique and distinct from the other deities. You're never going to confuse a Slaaneshi demon or mortal as a follower of Nurgle. Traditionally speaking, their units have a much wider color palette than other followers of Chaos, though pinks and purples are predominant. Nudity has been mostly removed from modern sculpts, but is still paid lip service via asynchronous exposed breasts, but these are exclusive to non-humanoid creatures such as fiends and seekers. With the exception of Space Marine units and a couple of mortal units from the Age of Sigmar line, heavy armor is almost non-existent within Slaaneshi factions. Both mortal and demon followers alike are often depicted with a lot of exposed skin, and an attire consisting of elegant fabrics or clothing that draws heavy inspiration from BDSM culture. normally
Makes
consisting
sense.
of leather straps, harnesses, corsets, chains, whips, piercing, and a bunch of tasteful thigh highs. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the negatives. And I'll
Okay.
admit, this is definitely me being a bit nitpicky and thinking way too hard about this particular subject. But if the visual language used in a character's design is supposed to tell me at a glance what they're all about, the Slaanesh model line fails miserably, especially when compared to the other deities. The design elements that are a core component of Slaanesh's brand are all about sex. It's no wonder that newcomers to Warhammer often assume that Slaanesh is the god of perversion specifically, because when you look at all of their units, that's the only message being conveyed to the audience.
Okay,
It gets even
okay.
weirder when you realize that older Slaaneshi models used to be way more sexual. Just look at the famous Juan Diaz sculpts for the Demonettes before their modern equivalent came out in 2008. So Slaanesh models were toned down to be a
yeah.
bit more PG-13,
Yep.
which personally I don't really have an issue with.
Right.
Now don't get me wrong, I'm not
'Cause you're going to a
prude and
wider
I have no
audience
problem
and
with
stuff.
nudity or R-rated models, but Warhammer is a social game played in shared spaces that
Yep.
often have a lot of
And you
people
got
that are
kids and stuff
underage,
like
whether
that.
they're playing Warhammer themselves or they're just kind of existing in that space playing something else.
Yep.
Toning it down was ultimately for the best, and if players want something a bit more risque, there are tons of third-party companies that make proxies that they can purchase. Not sponsored by them, but shout out to Creaturecaster as they're my personal favorite. I mean, just
Oh.
look at this proxy for a Keeper of Secrets. It's
Whoa.
amazing. Anyways, the major issue that I have with the direction that game...
Whoa. Let's go back and see it. Whoa. That looks badass. That looks pretty cool. I'm gonna have to definitely go check out that
For a
website.
Keeper of Secrets.
Just
It's
for
amazing.
fun.
Anyways, the major issue that I have with the direction that Games Workshop has decided to go in is the often worsening disconnect between the lore and the models. Again, the lore tells us that Slaanesh is not a sex god, that sexuality is the tiniest portion of what they represent, and that excess comes in infinite different forms.
Right.
Yet, all of the changes that they've made to existing models and new kits that have been released are doubling down on Slaanesh's sexual side, just in the safest, no-teeth, milquetoast way possible. They may have covered up the titties, but they did so with BDSM gear. Now, I'm not new to Warhammer. I've been into this stuff for 20 years, so sometimes it's admittedly difficult for me to try to see something through the eyes of a newcomer. But
Right.
I guarantee if you were to place an army from each one of the four gods in front of a new player
It'd be
that doesn't
easier
have any
to-
context or knowledge of the lore, they're instantly going to be able to pick up on
Yep.
demons of rage, plague, sorcery,
Yep.
and ultimately sex.
Right.
Where is the wide spectrum of excess with these models? How is any vice other than gooning being represented here? And to be fair, if I had to give any kind of credit
Well, how do you
here,
represent
I would
some of
point
that
to the
in a
themes
model?
of Slaanesh as actually being
You know?
kind of representative of excess.
How do you do a model like that? How do you do like a model of excessive eating and drinking? I mean, I guess you can. I don't know. I'm sure there's definitely ways to do it, but it's just like, all right, well, my excess is eating and stuff like that. It's, like, what type of model do you do for that? Like, what would my model look like? Running around with like chicken legs in my hands and stuff like that. And it's like something like you'd see like Ogre Kingdoms, doing. If it's like drinking wine, I mean, I guess I could have like, I don't know, a chalice with wine or something like that. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how you would, do models like that.
They're a fusion of animal, demon, and human parts into a grotesque amalgamation that still stays faithful to the design guidelines for Slaanesh. But once again,
That
this was a
is a
design that's
terrifying
existed
picture.
since the late 80s when Slaanesh was the pleasure god. And the excess that is on display here, it really is just an excess of legs, titties, and bondage. Now, ironically, some effort to correct this has been made, but it's done exclusively in the Age of Sigmar line of models. By its very nature, gluttony goes hand in hand with excess, and glutos here perfectly encapsulates this often
Oh.
underexplored aspect of Slaanesh.
Oh, wow.
Likewise, the excess of
I
pride
haven't
and
seen that
vanity
model yet.
is definitely in line with modern Slaanesh, and we see that perfectly in the Prince of Slaanesh, Sigval. with his mewing face, flowing hair,
That's
and
pretty
polished
cool.
armor.
Yeah, Sigmar
now, I'm
is
not a
pretty
huge
interesting.
Sigmar lore guy, but apparently
Yeah,
this guy's
neither am I.
honor guard all fight with shields that have been polished to a mirror finish, so Sigvald here can watch himself as he fights. It's great,
wow.
and I love it. Now,
Huh.
the Keeper of Secrets model is
Yeah, I don't know
playable
much
in
about
both
him.
game systems, and though it definitely fits the established brand language for Slaanesh that we discussed before, such as the skewing of armor in the favor of fine silks being draped around them thing going on, but it's not really excess. There's no real excess being explored here. Meanwhile, over here with the named Keepers of Secrets that are exclusive
Those
to Age of
look
Sigmar,
awesome.
their clothing takes excess to the absolute extreme.
Those
I mean,
look
just
so
look at
cool.
those gaudy bastards. If those clothes aren't excessive, I don't know what is. So what is the meat?
They probably do it with the bigger ones just because of, one, how expensive they are, and two, how many of those you're going to be taking in an army, as compared to like these ones here, which are your main troops. You can take a lot of those. The other ones there are a lot bigger and stuff like that, so when a 2,000 point game, you might only be able to take one. I don't know what the points are now and stuff like that, but back when I was playing and stuff like that, something like that, you'd only be able to take maybe one in a game if you're doing like at least 2,000 points. With these ones here, yeah, you probably get 20, 30 of them or something like that. Once again, don't know the points, but yeah, maybe that's why they do the bigger ones justice and the small ones not. I don't know. Just my guess.
Major issue here. Why do Slaanesh units in 40k look the way that they do, in that sexuality is the exclusive theme being pushed, if Games Workshop has been making active efforts to get away from this for 2 decades? Well, unfortunately, we don't really know the truth, as Games Workshop hasn't made any concrete information pertaining to this publicly available. But
Would be
I
fun
did
to do an
waste
interview
4 years
with,
of my life and way too much money getting
I
a
don't know,
bachelor's degree in marketing with
the
a focus
head
on
lore
design.
guy.
So I'm going to go ahead and actually use
Or
that degree for once and make some educated
whoever's the one in
guesses.
charge of all
There's
that.
a few different things going on here, but the most important one is that even though Slaanesh's lore has changed and become more nuanced, their overall visual brand has not. It was established in a different time, when Slaanesh was a different thing. Deviating from an established brand identity is always a risky move, even for the most subtlest of changes.
Right.
This is something that is true of all brands in every industry and every market, and billions of dollars are spent each and every year on market research when it comes to updating them. A model line for Games Workshop is no exception, as they are incredibly protective of their IP and notoriously slow to adopt change. The designers are forced to work within these established guidelines, even if they're outdated. Now, the reason we see actual change occurring in the Sigmar line is likely that their teams are given a lot more creative freedom than the 40k teams. I don't have any source on this, but it makes sense if you think about it. Sigmar is not the cash cow that 40k is,
Right.
nor does it even have a fraction of the lore, history, media, and associated products that its larger cousin does.
Right.
From my
I mean, I don't even know anything really about Age of Sigmar. I did fantasy. I liked fantasy. I like fantasy and 40k. I took part in the End Times campaign and stuff like that with Archeon and stuff. And then this Age of Sigmar, I don't know anything about it. Now you got like Orders of the Grand Alliance and Orders of Chaos, and like half, some of the old factions are like gone, and wait a minute, like Dark Elves are like part of the Grand Alliance now, and like these ones here are Orders of Destruction. It's like, what? And like what happened to like half the characters? Like I think isn't what's his name? Of the Dark Elves, I play him a lot in Total War, because he's actually pretty badass. He's pretty good. Malekith, the Witch King. Yeah, I think like he's gone in Age of Sigmar. I think. I haven't followed Age of Sigmar, so I have no idea what happened. I don't even know who like these like wannabe knockoff Space Marines are.
perspective, it's apparent that if the Sigmar team wants to try out something new, they're more than welcome to do so. Sigmar's universe is still in a somewhat malleable state, whereas 40K by contrast has become set in stone.
Yep.
If the Sigmar team wants to experiment with steampunk sky dwarves, elves riding around on sea monsters, the bone daddies, or kangaroo elves, they can go buck wild. If any of the changes they make or any of their designs don't end up working out, they can just scrap them and go back to the drawing board. From a designer's perspective, this is kind of great, even though it's not exactly great for the players who invested in those products. Which, quick tangent, Games Workshop owes Beast of Chaos and Stormcast players an actual non-corporate speak apology. But that's a topic for a different video. The 40K team is clearly not afforded the same level of creative freedom.
Yeah,
Their
it's just
designers,
kind of a shame.
although incredibly talented, seem to be stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't deviate from the established brand identity. They still have to keep things sexual, but not too sexual. And they can't try anything truly new without first having to navigate through millions of miles of red tape and consulting an army of lawyers and marketers. I thought about cutting this analogy as it's not perfect, but imagine if Games Workshop overhauled the Space Wolves lore so they didn't just venerate wolves, but they venerated all animals. Lions, tigers, bears, ravens, hell, let's throw some lizards and spiders in there too. But over the next 20 years, the only thing that we ever saw represented in their models was wolves, and even more wolves. It's a commonly held belief that whether in the form of models or rules, Age of Sigmar often ends up acting like a testing ground for 40K. Ideas that prove themselves successful over there will end up being transported into the larger franchise, as to minimize the risk to Games Workshop's bread and butter. So who knows, maybe in the future the Slaanesh model line will end up actually exploring different forms of excess, which in my personal opinion would be great. It would be much more in line with the lore. But that being said, the problems with Slaanesh unfortunately would not be fixed. In fact, many of their issues I don't think can be fixed, as they stem from the idea of excess itself, and Slaanesh's confused identity within the Chaos Pantheon. Another major problem with Slaanesh is that they tend to overlap pretty substantially with each of the other gods, so much so that it's a bit of a meme to debate whether or not something is actually secretly empowering Slaanesh. Nurgle, Khorne, and Tzeentch don't really have this issue. They each stay within their own lane. Now, it's true that all of the gods have a ridiculous amount of nuance, and if you dig deep enough, you will find some places where they intersect. But for the most part, this is pretty minimal.
They stay in their own lanes.
Khorne is the god of rage, bloodshed, and murder, and thus all of his followers are frothing barbarian psychopaths. Nurgle is the lord of plague, disease, and rot,
and that's what their characters look like.
Bloated with rot and pestilence, and have a sour, somber, and depressed personality. Tzeentch is the lord of sorcery, lies, and treachery. So
which is why all their characters like wizardry
and chasing down forbidden lore in order to grow into more powerful sorcerers. Back in the day, when Slaanesh was simply the Dark Prince of Pleasure, they too fit into their own unique niche. But now that they are the god of excess, it gets considerably more complicated to define how they and their followers actually fit into the pantheon. Is excess not on full display with each of the other gods? Aren't emotions taken to their extreme kind of the entire point of chaos as a whole?
Yes, what if I have an excess of
somehow
strength?
Not represent an excess of rage and hatred? It seems like there was a pretty solid attempt to make Slaanesh distinct in the form of making them representative of all of humanity's vices. To add to this, their own personal realm clearly takes inspiration from Dante's Inferno, and presents Slaanesh as representative of the seven
I was watching a video
sins.
about that.
In the lore, it states that Slaanesh's realm is made of 6 rings with their palace at the center. The first ring tests an individual's greed, the second their gluttony, the third their lust, the fourth and fifth both a mixture of their envy and pride, and finally the sixth their sloth. The only sin not really represented here is wrath, which is understandable as that's kind of Khorne's whole
thing.
bag. But when you stop to think about it, aren't most of these sins also represented by the other Chaos gods? Isn't gluttony and sloth strongly associated with Nurgle? Isn't envy and greed a hallmark of Tzeentch and their followers? What you have here is a deity that's supposed to represent excess in all of its forms, being explored further by a Chaos realm representative of the 7 deadly sins. Yet since those deadly sins are already firmly established as intrinsic parts of the other Chaos deities, the only 2 that are really left for Slaanesh is lust and pride, which again is beholden to their original design philosophy that Games Workshop is supposedly trying to get away from. And hell, honestly, let's take pride off the table as well, as all demons are prideful by their very nature, so all they've got is lust. So Slaanesh really is just a sex god after all. Ultimately, it's a shame, because I really like Slaanesh. I think their lore is fascinating, and when used correctly, they can be incredibly creepy. I love how one of their cults was depicted in the Horus Heresy novel Vengeful Spirit. I love that creepy gross old dude that suddenly becomes jacked and beautiful and the best damn night pilot you ever did see. I also love Slaanesh's depiction on the smaller and more intimate scale, like the horror story Pentimento, which gives us a fascinating and unnerving look at just how subtle and creepy Slaaneshi corruption really is. Which, by the way, I made a Grimdark Story Hour video on that one, so definitely check it out. There are so many interesting elements to Slaanesh, more so than any of the other gods. The Dark Prince can be depicted in 1,000 different ways with 1,000 different unique stories to tell. As somebody who's obsessed with the Black Library novels, I genuinely really enjoy how open to interpretation Slaanesh can often be. You never really know what you're going to get with them, and it makes them one of the most fun gods to read about. But on the macro perspective, when we're looking at the entirety of the 40K franchise, the huge disconnect that exists between what we are told and what we are shown makes it clear that even though Games Workshop claims they want them to be more than just a god of pleasure, they aren't really fully willing to commit to that new direction. Which honestly, side note, it's baffling to even call it a new direction, as these changes were made like 2 decades ago. Warhammer is a crazy, bombastic, over-the-top universe where everything is taken to its extremes. But when Games Workshop is writing for or creating models for the deity that's literally supposed to represent extremes, there's suddenly this weird, uncanny timidness. Personally speaking, I don't think Games Workshop actually knows what they want Slaanesh to be. I believe that any potential path forward is always held back by factors of both indecision within the company and marketing, the end result being a sloppy, confused mess. But what do you think of all this? Do you agree with all the points I made in this video, or do you think I've missed the point entirely? Do you like the way Slaanesh is currently depicted, or do you think it would be better if Games Workshop just didn't hold back? How do you think Slaanesh compares to the other Chaos gods? And not just in matters of coolness, but in design, marketability, and their place within both 40K's lore and the wider franchise. Personally speaking, I'm getting kind of tired of seeing Nurgle and Khorne represented in all of the video games, and I want Darktide to add demonettes. Do it, you cowards, make it weird. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, we're on the road to 1 million subs, so do your part in the long war and help us reach that goal. It's free, and you'll be one of the cool guys that was here before 1 million. Anyways, let me know all of your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, and ideas for future videos.
Okay, so there we go. There is about Slaanesh. Very interesting. You know, yeah, I think the big part is marketing. You know, how do you market something, you know, sexual and stuff like that? It is, you know, a little hard, you know, especially with, like I said, you're you know, basically you're expanding now. You're going more mainstream and stuff like that, and it's going to be a little bit harder to market that stuff. And yeah, and I mean, it a lot of points he does make are pretty damn spot on. You know, everyone's got like their own set thing. You know, Khorne, god of blood and rage, so all your models look jacked and muscular. Nurgle, disease, they're all like bloated and like guts spilling out and all that stuff. And Tzeentch is all wizardry and magic and stuff like that. And then Slaanesh is Slaanesh, you know, excess of sex, but of everything else, but we only just represent that. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I wonder what some of the comments say about that. The Punkulaba. This is fine. Nudity. Oh my god, we're opening ourselves to legal action and marketability. Well, I mean, with books and stuff like that. Books, you know, books are a different thing, you know. In books, you can write whatever you want. You're not actually seeing, you know, unless there's pictures in the books. You know, you can write whatever you want in a book because there's nothing to actually see, where models and stuff like that are a little bit different. I'm afraid of boobs, James Workshop. Slaanesh is terrifying to me because it's in human nature. We want more and more of every passion. Yeah, because then, well, if it's excess of whatever, you know, like, what if it is like excess of like working out? What if like someone just like, yeah, I'd love to work out, I'll have to get jacked and stuff like that, you know, I gotta work out more and stuff. Well, now you kind of like knocking on like Korn's door and stuff, like, oh well, you want to get jacked and stuff. Well, wait, he has an excessive amount of it. He likes to work out a lot, so that sounds pretty excessive to me. So now he belongs to me, or does he? You know, so it's kind of interesting. So it's just when you keep telling yourself you'll stop, but never do. I feel like Slaanesh is best seen as the corruption of what you hold dear. Korn gets to embrace your anger. Nurgle has you give up hope. Tzeentch has in your head and warps what is and what isn't. But Slaanesh turns your love into personal torture. Pretty interesting take. Ain't no party like a Slaanesh party. Back in the 90s, Games Workshop produced a white dwarf with two armies, one the Dark Elf, the other Slaaneshi. Neither were safe for work or children. The Inquisition Wars were from the 90s, and Games Workshop definitely is still into the real Slaanesh. I wish I saw some of the 90s stuff. That would be interesting. That's not going to be a graphic imagery. Bunch of tortured dead bodies beside him. Okay, so yeah, very interesting take on it. Like I said, it seems like, yeah, these days we only get PG-13 Slaanesh. The nerd moms would lose it if they gave us the real version. Yeah, see, I mean, maybe if it was still, you know, if Games Workshop and 40K was still a niche market, then yes, maybe. But now that it's becoming a little bit more mainstream, now you go into a wider audience, and yeah. That is probably the big reason why. It's just marketing, you know, but it is what it is. So anyways, there we go. There is the video. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think about Slaanesh? Do you think they should stick to the way they were, or do you think they should have changed and adapt? You know, let me know your thoughts. Leave me all your thoughts and comments down below. Love to read it. And other than that, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. That'd be awesome. Remember, feel free to subscribe to my channel. Follow me on social media. Links in the description box below. And if you have any videos you want me to check out, let me know down below in the comment section, and I'd be happy to do a video on them. So other than that, just stick around. More videos are on the way, and I will see you guys next time.